It's time for a Grom guide, everybody. Woo! Mostly we're just gonna talk about how to hit his attacks basically all the time, because that's really freaking important. And then on the flip side, if you're facing a Grom, how you dodge his attacks because they're extremely annoying. And same goes for his super. How do you hit people easier with it, and how do you dodge it if someone throws it at you? And as you know, we always do on this channel plenty of other extremely helpful tips along the way. You definitely want to watch until the very end, because all of these tips are meant to be used in combination, and without even just one of them, you might be doing a lot worse than you could be doing when playing your Grom. Hey, I'm just spitting facts, okay? Now, honestly, Grom might be nerfed by the time you're watching this video because he's really strong. That being said, they're probably not going to have changed his attack it that much, so all the tips will probably still be mostly applicable. Highly recommend you still watch even if that's the case. And if it's not the case, I'm sorry, we're still living in a Grom meta. But let's start with how you actually hit his attack. The main issue that some people might be having with Grom is that if you just throw one attack at a time at long range, it's pretty easy to dodge. You can generally see where the attack's going to land, and so you just boop diagonally any of the different ways, and you should be able to completely avoid getting hit. Now, I'll give you that it is sometimes hard to see where it's going to land because it's kind of unclear where its path is going to stop. You can sort of see the direction it's traveling, but you don't know where it's going to explode. It's kind of hard to tell that because the depth perception in the game is kind of weird, but generally speaking, you get used to it, and it gets pretty easy to dodge the attacks one at a time at max range. So there's a couple ways you can get around this. One is to just don't be at max range and get really close to people, because the closer and closer you get, the airtime of your shots scales down to basically nothing. So you're basically just instantly using your attack when you tap your attack button, as long as your opponents are right on top of you. So that's obviously great because your opponents have no time to react. You probably figured this out from playing Grom, but just to let you know, if you can ever get up close against a wall that your opponent's on the other side from, you'll be super close to them without being in danger of their attacks, unless, you know, they're also playing Grom. Sometimes happens. Do be like that sometimes. But in that situation, just spam auto aim, you're good to go, your attacks will land almost immediately, they'll have no time to dodge, and that's an easy way to guarantee a ton of damage. But that is not always the case. So when you're at long range, there still are plenty of ways you can get your attacks to hit. The best and most consistent way I found is to just throw two attacks at a time and slightly offset them both in the x-axis and the y-axis. So forward and backward and left to right, you want to offset your attacks. And if you do it right, by the time the projectiles land, they'll essentially split and form like a rectangle in the middle, and your opponents are going to be boxed into that rectangle. And so no matter which way they go, they're going to get hit by something. And that's obviously the best case scenario. Sure, you're only hitting 50% of your attacks that way because you can only guarantee one shot for every two that you throw, but it's definitely better than nothing, which is a lot of time what you'll get if you only throw one attack at a time at long range. And sometimes you'll just hit both of them because your opponents are confused when there's two things in the air, they don't know what to dodge, and then they'll just screw up and get hit by both of them. Also happens too. But this way, at least you'll guarantee that you'll get some damage. And that's really good thing to know, because if your opponents are one shot away from death and they're just trying to escape, or they have like 10 gems in gem grab, it's super important that you pick up a kill. It's kind of inconsistent to kill them with just one shot at a time because they can maybe just dodge all of them. But if you throw them two at a time, you can make it so that it's basically impossible for your opponents to dodge, and that way you can guarantee damage in the situations when you need it. And this is something that you need to remember to do, otherwise this rectangle strategy won't really work, is you want to throw the projectile that's farther away from you first, because that projectile will take longer to land. So since you throw that one first and then you throw the one closer to you second, there's that offset of time in between when you're throwing them, and that's just going to make up for the extra time that that first one has to travel in the air. So that means they're going to land at about the same time if you throw the one that's farther away from you first. So just keep that in mind, because otherwise the one that's closer to you will hit the ground a lot earlier, and then they might be able to easily dodge both of them because there's a big gap of time in between when both of them are landing. Another great thing you can do with Grom is just throw your attack directly next to a corner. This works great on maps where there's grass around the corner because you can really easily scout that grass out, since Grom's attack goes forward and backward and to the left and the right in a straight line. This is something that Spike can't do, which is sometimes kind of annoying when playing Spike, is that you can never hit forward or backward. So Grom is going to be great for hitting those patches of grass that go straight forward or backward, and you can get it around a corner so that you're also hitting around left and right. Then you can cover a ton of spots with just a single attack, and if the walls are placed right, there's nowhere else for your opponents to move other than just around that corner. So that can definitely guarantee you some shots in certain positions. And then another extremely effective way to hit a ton of your shots is to use your super and then immediately spam a bunch of auto aim attacks after that, because your super hits a lot of the time. And I'll definitely get more into the super after this, but if your super hits your opponents, they'll be knocked back for about half a second, and when they're knocked back, they can't dodge. And them not dodging is obviously really great for you when you have an attack that does a ton of damage. So right after you use your super, if you just spam a bunch of auto aim attacks, they'll all gonna land generally in the area where that person is gonna get knocked back to. And so you're basically guaranteeing that every shot you throw immediately after the super will connect. And this is an extremely easy way to just take someone from full health down to 0 basically instantly. This is why Grom is so good, is because he can just directly assassinate anyone he wants to by going super and then just spamming auto aim. Now, when you do auto aim in this way, sometimes they'll get pushed diagonally, and so they'll get pushed into the area where your attack doesn't deal damage, and so you'll miss some of the attacks after. That is something to keep in mind. So sometimes, if you can do it fast enough, you can manually aim those shots that come after the super. But again, that's only if you can kind of predict where they're going to get pushed from the super, and that's kind of hard to do because it has a really weird hitbox, which I'll get into. But that's like 4 different ways right there that you can use to connect your shots a lot easier with Grom. And just implementing those, if you haven't already, is going to take your Grom gameplay up a lot. Now, the best way to learn a new character is to learn what to do when you're facing against it, because that way you can know what your opponents are thinking and counterplay them as necessary. So if you're ever facing a Grom and they're throwing single shots at you, which I just told you not to do, you should usually throw them 2 at a time to make that rectangle shape. And in that case, there's honestly nothing you really can do because it is guaranteed to hit you. But if they make the rectangle too wide, you could just like stand still and not get hit by standing in the middle of the rectangle, but it's very hard to predict that. But anyway, if they're just throwing shots 1 at a time, you always want to start out by dodging the shot from left to right, not by moving forwards or backwards, at least not right at the start of when they throw the shot. And that's because when they throw a shot at you, they're usually throwing it mostly forward or backward, right? Because they're on their side of the field and you're on your side of the field, and the direction from them to you is usually almost directly forward or maybe a bit angled, but most of that direction is straight towards you. So it's really easy to predict about where the shot's gonna land in the forward backward direction. The hard part is knowing at what point it's gonna stop and then split off from left to right. So whenever they throw a shot, you know sort of like the line it's gonna travel, and you can move left or right to avoid that straight line. And then after the shot has traveled a bit longer, then you can get a better estimate of exactly where it's gonna land, and then you can move forward or backward to dodge the projectiles that are gonna split out to the left and to the right. Now, something that helps with this is looking at wherever the peak of their attack is, because Grom's attack travels in an arc, and so wherever it hits the peak is about the halfway point of the attack. So if the shot reaches the peak and it's about halfway in between you and the Grom, that means you're standing about right where it's gonna land. So you gotta move either forward or backward. It doesn't really matter to avoid the left and right projectiles at that point. Now, when the shot's at its peak, if it's closer to the Grom than it is to you, that means you're farther back than where the shot's gonna land. So you wanna keep moving backward and don't try to move forward to dodge a shot, because you're gonna walk right into it. And then vice versa, if the shot is closer to you than to the Grom at its peak, you want to keep moving forward rather than going backward, because if you go backward, you're going to walk right into the shot. And keeping those things in mind, it'll come a lot more naturally as you do it more. That's going to help you dodge the Grom shots even better. And that's actually something you can use to dodge the super as well, is by looking at the peak of the shot, because that basically marks the halfway point. And it's pretty easy to see because it's when the circle stops getting bigger and starts to get smaller. You can basically see the peak on the screen just from that visual cue, and then use its distance away from the Grom and its distance away from you to estimate about where it's gonna land, and then continue dodging accordingly. Still really hard to dodge because the super is freaking huge, but it's definitely possible. So now let's briefly move on to talking about the super, like I promised. Just like with the normal attack, it's usually a pretty good idea to get close to people if you can without putting yourself in a dangerous position, because then you can just tap auto aim, and because your super is so freaking big, it'll just hit them no matter where they go, because it's really, really easy to get hit by it. The hitbox is several tiles wide for determining whether or not it'll actually hit opponents. So if you can get pretty close to them, you can basically guarantee the super's gonna hit. And then, like I was talking about before, you can just follow up with a bunch of auto aim attacks, and then you just get a ton of damage on whoever got hit by your super. Now, if they're farther away, you probably will have to manually aim it, although auto aiming still works if they can't move in a diagonal direction to dodge it, because if they're forced to move left or right, then they're just going to be walking along where the projectile's path is anyway, so they're going to get hit no matter where they move. In that situation, you can just auto aim it because it's guaranteed to hit them. But at far distances, you should usually tend to manually aim the super, though you sort of get a feel for what's consistent and what's not the more you play him. The one thing to keep in mind about Grom super is the fact that it does break walls, so you have to be careful to not completely destroy your own walls by throwing your super directly in front of them and then the backwards projectile comes and destroys your walls. This usually comes into play in Brawl Ball because that's when the walls are the most important because they block your opponents from just going straight into your goal. But the more I played Grom, the more I realized the wall break is actually extremely little because the hitbox is like really janky. Like it usually only breaks 1 or 2 tiles max. And a lot of times it looks like it's breaking fewer walls than it really should be breaking. So honestly, I found that using my super around my goal isn't even a big issue most of the time because I'll just like knock 1 tile of wall off, and it's not the biggest deal when it comes down to it, especially if you can get your super to connect and get a free kill or free 2 kills from it. It's usually worth it in that situation because it just doesn't do much wall break. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, but it is useful on the offense because if you just break the center 2 of your opponent's walls that are right in front of the goal, it gives you a nice open shot later on in the game. That's basically all the tips with the super though, because there's not much else to it. You just kind of throw it and it does all the work for you. So it is what it is, I guess. Moving on to the Gadget and Star Powers briefly, because they're not that complicated. Now, with the Gadget, if there's a lot of bushes, you can put it in a relatively open spot because even just seeing where your opponents are for a brief period of time is extremely helpful for making sure you don't have to check like every single bush you come across on those really bushy maps. But generally try to make it as secure as possible because it's extremely powerful if you can keep it up for a long period of time. Because your opponents can basically just never use the grass at all. It's just a better Terra gadget for those specific pieces of grass, as long as you can keep it up. It's basically the same as all the other turret gadgets. And then with his star power, it lets you get that movement speed boost when you have your super. I've definitely found this useful in Brawl Ball when you defend and you just charge up your super and then you have to run all the way across to the other side of the field to push up with your teammates. It's very, very helpful just for shaving off like a little bit of time. But in general, there's not really any ways you can really take advantage of this or cheese your opponents in any way. And the new star power that's coming out that boosts his damage, I think is going to be a lot better because he already does so much damage. Why not tack on a little bit more, you know? I absolutely can't wait for that one to come out and make him even more busted than he already is. That's basically it. Not much to it. You just throw your attacks, hit your opponents, throw your super. It's the same as a normal attack. Also hit your opponents. Bing, bang, boom. You won yourself the game. Easy as that. Go have fun with Grom. Hopefully this helped. See y'all later.